Frank DiStefano. Welcome to The Realignment.
Thanks a lot for having me.
This episode has been a long time coming. I actually told this to you before we started recording, but I purchased your book a month or two before we launched the show back in 2019. And unfortunately, I didn't read it because when you launch a podcast, you very quickly get subsumed in books. But I actually regret, genuinely so, waiting this long, because actually just reading through it has helped me better articulate and better encapsulate the moment, the ideas we're trying to really focus on here. So it's super awesome to have you and everything.
Yeah, I'm thrilled too. I'm a big fan of what you guys do. So let's talk about realignments.
So let's start with the personal real quick, which is what got you interested in this topic specifically, in terms of your background, your political experiences recently, everything like that.
Yeah, it was really a question of it really started with the 2008 campaign, because I had been a Hill staffer. I had worked on the Hill in the 90s. I had worked I was national political director for issues for Rudy's 2008 campaign, and then went over and helped out with McCain's campaign. But there was kind of a couple of years between there where I was kind of not really working in politics, where, I'd worked on the Hill, I went to law school, I was practicing law for a while, and then I went into the campaign. So, and in between, I felt like something was wrong, right? On that campaign, so this was already in 2008, I felt like something was happening in politics that was odd, that I had to solve. And after that, I really got obsessed with this idea of, something was breaking down in politics, and that I didn't know what it was. And there was a little bit of personal, like I wanted to chart out what I wanted to do. I'd always, my original plan in life was, I wanted to run for office and do that kind of thing. And I was trying to figure out where things were going. So I started getting interested in figuring it out. And so I just started, looking into the books to figure it out. And what I realized is that, so you start reading and you start saying, okay, well, how does what's happening today compare to where we've been in the past? And every time you start doing it, you start peeling another onion layer out about things that you didn't know about, because, you get the sort of high school history version of political history, but it leaves a ton out. But more than that, the real frustrating thing is so much of it is siloed, right? So when we think about politics, like if you're like a participant in politics today, and say you're dealing with the Republican Party, well, you would know just naturally, how many things are affecting what the Republicans are doing. Social history, religious history, right? You'd know that they're like, okay, well, the religious right, well, that was that's a big movement. Where did the evangelical movement come from? That evangelical thought is important to what's going on, right? But when you read political history, it doesn't do that. It's just polls and statistics and political leaders, as if everything else going on in the country isn't going on. So then you start realizing that a lot of political history and political science is very siloed, where it doesn't engage with the economic history, with the history of ideas, about the social and moral history. So, I start having to peel back further layers of the onion to piece together what was really going on, to kind of build, and this is what some people have said that I've really liked about the book, is that it's sort of a unified theory of political parties, that you had to kind of construct a unified theory of all these different silos that don't talk to each other about, okay, realignment theory is something that's existed since the 1950s, though it's been so long since a realignment, it's kind of fallen out of fashion because people keep waiting for the realignment and it hadn't happened. And, now that it's here, all of a sudden people were interested again.
Sounds quasi-religious when you're describing it that way. Everyone's waiting for the realignment. It never comes.
I mean, there's a whole interesting history about this, in the 60s and 70s and the Nixon campaign. And, everybody in politics in that era, from late 60s to the 80s, was, realignment theory was sort of on top, and everybody was looking for everything to be a realignment. And Nixon shaped his 72 campaign. He had political scientists on. The whole thing was built around that he was going to lead the realignment. Like he was using realignment theory and political science, and that was his Law and Order campaign in 72 was all built around that. But what happened was, people then got frustrated because when it didn't happen, And people thought, well, they moved on to other ideas. And now everybody's come back to it because it was like, it just took longer than everybody thought, right? And the thing about realignments, this is why I say the unified theories, there's not a lot about like how and why do they work, right? What are the ebbs and flows of politics that cause this cycle to happen? It's not just sort of, voodoo magic that every so many years the parties collapse. There's a reason behind it, right? There's a process about why it is that we create parties the way we do, why it is that they decay, and why it is they fall apart. And once you understand that, how that meets with the story of America, then you start seeing the patterns in where we are now. And you're like, well, of course we're having one right now, because all the conditions that create a realignment have happened again. So, you kind of need that unified theory of how all these things interact. And once you have it, you can see these patterns as they repeat again and again. And, the situations and the issues are always different, but the broader idea is the same, which is, political parties are ultimately about these great debates. They're how we channel our views on whatever is a big crisis issue at a time. And they divide us into two groups as we have this debate. And then we carry on that debate for decades and decades until eventually it gets resolved. And then when it gets resolved, we have to, the parties start decaying. They don't immediately collapse. They, careerism and inertia take over, and they start decaying and nothing gets done and the system gets corrupt again. You start getting things. This is the era of good feelings, or the Gilded Age, or the 1840s, or the Roaring 20s. And, politics stagnates and nothing gets done, and everyone's getting frustrated, and there's a new crisis brewing. And then eventually the crisis comes and knocks the old system down, and then we got to build it again. And how do we do it? We build two parties around, two new political coalitions, probably a better word than parties, around solving that new crisis.
Well, that gets to something. And I like your nuance on new political coalitions and not political parties, because it gets to not an objection to the book or the framework, but a quibble, because it's not that political parties die, quote unquote. So for example, you talk to a Democrat, a hacky Democrat, maybe they'll say the Democratic Party is the oldest political party that's ever existed in the Western world, because technically speaking, something approximating the Democratic Party has existed since roughly Andrew Jackson. You could push it even back further, technically speaking, to Jefferson.
But I would say Jackson.
Jackson, Jefferson. Actually, that's the Jefferson-Jackson dinner. It used to be a thing. The point is, it hasn't died. But the point you're making is that the coalitions that made up that thing are different. So it's like a record label, right? The record label company is still there, but the actual artists and the acts and the actual content is different every single time.
I like thinking about it too, like a sports franchise too, right? Like, okay, so like on paper, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Dodgers today are the same team, but is it like really the same team? No, because it plays in a different place, a completely different roster of players, different sort of philosophy and coaches. There's an institution, but it's that institution has changed a bunch of times over history. On paper, you treat it like the same team, but it's not really the same team. And the thing with the names don't always change when the parties change. So by a party, when we talk about party systems, they say that we've had 5 party systems, 5 distinct party systems of 2 parties. They had a unique coalition and a unique set of ideas. It stood for a unique thing, and it stayed that way for decades and decades, and then suddenly collapsed. And then you get 2 parties again with a different coalition of people and a different set of ideas, and it stands for something completely different. All right. So sometimes the names stay the same and sometimes they don't, depending on how that transition happens. So we've had a Democratic Party going back to Jackson, but we've had 4 different versions of a Democratic Party, and each version had a unique coalition of people, a unique ideology, a unique set of ideas that it cared about, and each era, each version, it stayed that way, consistent over decades and decades, until it came apart, and then we had a new version that was different. So, when I say party, I mean sort of not the brand name. The brand name doesn't matter. That each party is unique in what it stands for. And on that way, that's why we have 5 party systems and 5 they're really different parties because they stand for different things.
Well, here's what's fascinating, though, and we'll get to the history in a second. I got a couple more definitional questions, but sometimes the party label does matter. That's why it's fascinating, right? So, for example, you get into this Federalist, that becomes an epithet. So that actually was a party name, a party label, a sports franchise, pick your metaphor, that was actually so toxic that you actually can't rehabilitate it with new people. The Whigs, not toxic in the same way, but not sustainable. So it had to be dropped. So sometimes the labels do matter. I think what's unique about, I guess probably what you would say, our politics since the Civil War is that the labels themselves have stuck, and there hasn't been a totally cataclysmic event so discrediting in the manner that the War of 1812 was, and in the manner that the pre-Civil War eras for the Federalists and for the Whigs were today.
Yeah, and that's and then it's both the toxicness of the label and whether you get a figure who comes along to do a radical reform where they take over a party. Like, so, this is the William Jennings Bryan example, which I find probably the most fascinating of political history, what that guy pulled off, right? But, what he had done, there was a populist party, a third party that was sort of gaining steam across America, and it was winning governors and senators, and it was tapping into the new ideas that the American middle class, which at that time is family farmers.
So the 1890s, right? Just to set the timeline here.
Yeah. So we're talking 1896, and it's a real parallel to where we are now because, the big problem was industrialization. We have a new economic model, and it's killing the middle class, which is family farmers. And they're working hard and playing by the rules that they had always played by. And all of a sudden the rules changed. And there's these millionaires getting made in new industries, and they're falling behind, and they're getting pretty angry about it. And the political parties have nothing to say about it because we're still stuck in the Civil War era parties. And this is the Gilded Age. And politics is basically still waged on fighting Romanism and rebellion and waving the bloody shirt. And, it has nothing to do with the things people care about, which is, how come my family farm that I've had for generations is going under as deflation is eating away my crops and the railroads are sticking it to me, and now I can't get to market without these new railroad companies as middlemen and all this. All right, so what does Bryan do? Well, he wins, he's a 36-year-old kid. He's a two-term congressman, and he's out of office. He runs for Senate and loses. So he's got no office. He's 36, and he walks in the Democratic National Convention, and he gives that Cross of Gold speech, which is this big populist speech that energizes everybody. And it so energizes everybody that they give him the nomination for president. And then he takes the entire Democratic Party agenda, its ideology and what it stands for, its elites, throws them away and basically merges it with the Populist Party and takes all the populist ideas and imports it into the Democratic Party. All right, so the Democratic Party brand survives. And the way that story is told is, well, the Democratic Party co-opted the populists. But, I don't see it like that. I see it as a third party takeover, right? That's a new party. Basically, he threw out the guts of the Democratic Party and he imported the guts of the third party populist party and then reinvented it.
Because the key thing to add to your framework in terms of the history, though, because in the book, this is still fresh in my mind, your point is it's not just that when you talk about guts, you're talking about, staff isn't quite the equivalent because that's more of like a 20, but the apparatus is different. The figures are different. It's important to note that William Jennings Bryan captures the nomination 3 times. He goes on to be Secretary of State. So it's not as if, because this is a good point you're making, because if the Democratic Party captured the populists, then you would just see the same old people using new language. But that isn't what happens here.
No, right? That's exactly right. And William Jennings Bryan comes from, like I said, a 36-year-old nobody to, right? He wins the nomination 3 times. He basically dominates the party for the whole era. And the only, Democrat who then wins in his time is Wilson, and he was kingmaker for Wilson. Wilson only got the nomination because Bryan gave it to him. Bryan basically picked him and then became the Secretary of State. So, that whole era of the Democratic Party is the Bryan era. And so that's right. And, there was a third party movement when Bryan ran in 1896. The Democratic elite tried to split off. I think it was the National Democratic Party or something like that. And they lost. They basically got pushed out of the party. So it was a complete into a new institution, essentially, using the old name.
What's so fascinating about this is a quick tangent, but I'm just thinking about this in a historical context. And can you think of a single quote unquote losing figure who is more just present in most people's, you paid attention during junior year of his high school history, President William Jennings Bryan, right? So, because he loses pretty consistently, if you actually think about it, right? So he loses all three nominations. He loses when he's Secretary of State because America enters into World War I, and then he wins the Scopes monkey trial. But from the perspective of history, he loses. It's actually funny. Right. In many ways, he's seen as the quote unquote villain in that context. But if anything, a lot of his opposition to evolution was very admirable. So it was opposition to the eugenicist version of evolution. Mm-hmm. It was very much hey, I'm against the Gilded Age. A lot of Gilded Age people have like this really evil, bastardized version of evolutionary theory. So it's just, let's pour one out for William Jennings Bryan for a second.
Let me tell you, and we talk about the, YouTube videos. That's been like, I think that's the most popular video is William Jennings Bryan. Because he's fascinating. He's the fact that we don't talk about him more too is fascinating to me. Because again, that whole race in 1896. One, the fact that he, like I say, I keep fixating on 36 because I'm getting old. So now I look at that and I just can't believe that. I mean, it's basically like if AOC came and ran for the presidency instead and almost won the nomination, he would have won. He got real close
after losing her primary for Chuck Schumer, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like it'd be like if she ran against Chuck Schumer, lost, and then ran for president and got the nomination and then dominated the party for 30 years. It's really staggering politically what he did, and he's a huge figure in history. That he's in pop culture. He becomes a millionaire just as a speaker and writer. He's, when he goes to Europe, they follow him around like he's the queen, writing wherever he goes. He dominated that era. And so it's like, when you said who, it's like him and Henry Clay are the two who come to mind, mm-hmm. right? And Henry Clay's the other one who, just because he never won the presidency, people kind of forgot about him. And yet he dominated his era, him and Jackson in the way that Bryan dominated his era too. Those are the two sort of giants of American history that I feel like don't get enough credit for the just pure, presence that they had over the system.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a pin in this super tangent, but I love it because it's exciting and it's, to your point, the YouTube algorithm prefers it. So we're just going to lean into that. It stinks for him that him being such a big personality in American history runs into probably the biggest personality in American history, which is Theodore Roosevelt. So like, that's really, that's really, if you really just think about how, and we'll probably get into this during the history, but it's just very interesting that you have this period at the end of the 19th century where you had all these incredible figures just combined mm-hmm. into a very specific moment. So two quick last things.
After a period of stagnation.
Oh, exactly.
Right. And that's, after, between Reconstruction and 1896, it's probably there was a famous, the quote from, who was it? Henry Adams or whatever about, the entire 20-year period is just like I can't remember. Basically, it was just a corrupt waste. Nothing happened. Yeah. It was just it was probably the worst period in all of American history. And then to go from that to the populist and progressive era where you get Roosevelt and Bryan and just all of the intellectual and social movements and America becoming a great power. America emerging as a second-rate power, that's the era that America becomes, rich and prosperous, inventing the telephone and the airplane and all these inventions and coming to dominate the world. It's really just a fascinating period of time.
So for anyone who hasn't been paying attention, can you just quickly define what a political realignment actually is?
Sure. All right. So people think political parties change gradually over time, right? And we discussing, they don't. They stay the same for long periods of time, basically ideologically unchanged. And then in a period of about a decade, they collapse and get completely recreated with a new ideological debate. And that transition is a realignment. So a realignment is not about one demographic voting group going to one party to another. And that's what always frustrates me.
So to put a pin on this real quick, just to make sure this is clear, because I'm bringing in the context of our episodes we've done.
Yeah.
Joe Biden and the Democratic Party in 2020 overperforming with upper middle class suburbanites who used to be Eisenhower Republicans. That is not a realignment.
Correct. That could be the material to create a realignment, right? So, because the thing with what Joe Biden did is he didn't ideologically change anything. He basically ran on the 20th century Democratic agenda, right? He ran as the same sort of agenda and the same ideological coalition and the same ideological ideas that have been Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter or John Kennedy. Like, it's the same New Deal liberalism, right? New Deal liberalism was the idea that came out of the New Deal, this idea that we could merge populism and progressivism into a new ideology that had never existed, to say we could, experts could use social science and policy and planning to benefit working people, the marginalized, and the least well off. That's how I always put New Deal liberalism. And that's a new idea that had never existed until FDR stumbles into creating it. And that has been the motivating idea for the Democratic Party ever since. And Joe Biden runs on the same set of ideological ideas. So when the realignment changes that, where you have not just a new coalition, a new ideological base for the party.
You know what's so fascinating about this, which is I love the way you've constructed this, because it helps sort through good faith and bad faith critiques of people, in the sense that a talking point that you actually see, especially given the direction that Trump and especially Trump intellectuals tried to push the Republican Party in terms of we're the party of the working class, a talking point here is, and this isn't to defend Joe Biden, it's just to articulate the point you're making, which is, well, actually, the very upper middle class people who hated FDR, the very rich people who hate FDR, now vote for Joe Biden. And those working class, coal mining, metal pail lunchbox people that now vote for Trump. What happened to FDR's Democratic Party? The point is, within your framework, the set of voters could entirely switch. But all that really matters from a framework perspective is which party is articulating the viewpoint that the FDR coalition cemented. And the point is, as long as, frankly, the Biden presidency is advancing hefty stimulus packages and whatever Republican presidency isn't, it doesn't really matter who's voting who.
Exactly. And that's the whole thing with the Solid South and the Northeast, right? People like to focus on, so you go to 1932, the Northeast is the bastion of the Republican Party, and the South, the Solid South, is the bastion of the Democratic Party. All right, and now it's completely reversed. And people say, well, there must have been some kind of realignment because the people changed. But one, the people didn't change, right? The people who were voting, the Northeastern Republicans who voted for Hoover, they didn't change. Their kids voted differently than they did. So the first part is it wasn't even a real change, right? It was mostly a generational shift. And beyond that, it's why? Because the next generation, even though they lived in the same area, they had different values and beliefs for different reasons. History changed, so the voters who were attracted to those ideas changed. So the ideas stay the same, the parties stay the same, but which parts of the country are attracted to those ideas change. Well, it's not the parties that changed. It's the demographics of America changed. So the voting, which states vote for who, changes, but it doesn't mean that the parties are any different.
Let's talk about your idea of these eras as being shaped by big debates, because I want to know how much you think the outcome of these debates are inevitable or were sort of decided before the game even began. So a good example of this is immigration. So 1965, Lyndon Johnson's Congress passes the Immigration Act, and you see America permanently change in a very specific way. A immigration system which preferenced Western Europeans shifts to a much more global perspective in a way that oftentimes was not fully understood by even the people who were supporting the legislation. And you see the demographics of America just entirely change, irrespective of debates about undocumented immigrants. Complete sea change of the country, much more of a preference towards East Asians, South Asians, all these huge myriad period debates. So throughout the course of this fifth party system, one of the most polarizing issues we've had is the debate over immigration, amnesty, restrictionism, H-1B visas. We could give all these different examples. Some are economic, some are tied to like really like evil race stuff. Some are tied to basic debates about culture, which are entirely reasonable to have. But to a certain degree, if the debate is the country going to be the country of the 1950s, or is it going to be a country that looks very different? The second that legislation was passed, effectively it was over. So I'm curious how you just think about how debates operate like this, right? In the sense of how often are debates going to conclude inevitably, and how often are they not going to go that way?
All right. So I kind of see it a little differently, only because I don't think anybody ever wins a debate. I always think it's a synthesis. So when I look at each of these debates, so it's a push and pull, right? One side comes up with one set of ideas. The other side comes up with a contrary set of ideas. And ultimately, America resolves to take some from both. And that's when it gets resolved. No side ever 100% wins. What happens is the overreaches of each side get ironed down, and the good points of each get adopted, and then the debate dies. So to do that, like, okay, let's just look, we keep talking about going through the system. So let's just go over all the debates, right? All right, so the first party system is Federalists and Democratic Republicans. It's Hamilton and Jefferson. So what is that about? That is a debate about how do we translate this document, this set of documents, this republic that we wrote on paper. What does that mean in practice? And we have two different sets of ideas about what it's going to mean. You've got the sort of the Federalist, which is sort of a meritocratic republic, right? They have the Democratic Republicans would call them closet aristocrats, but that's not really right. They have a sense that a republic, this is this whole Republican virtue idea, that a republic really needs leaders and it needs people of certain character, and that they need to inculcate sort of to replace what they had in Europe, right? Europe has nobles who are bred from birth to rule, and we've never had a republic. So how would you run a republic? And the Federalists think, well, we have to somehow create what they have without nobles, and this meritocratic sort of create a meritocratic class,
urban centric. And then you have those very much like tied to that,
yeah. This is the sort of Hamiltonian perspective. So that a republic we're going to have this meritocratic commercial republic, versus the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson, who are looking at France and the French Revolution, and they have much more of a sort of a small government. They think a republic is based in the sort of small landholders and private farmers, and this is this debate about, all right, no one's ever made a modern republic. What is it going to be? How do we translate this into practice? And the answer that we came up with was some of both, right? Jefferson won the politics. The Federalist Party died, and not only did it die, Jefferson, when he was president, the Federalists were already weak by 1808. But yet, you look at the policies, he basically adopted Hamilton's banking plan and most of Hamilton's policies.
There's this great quote I just want to bring it out because I didn't know about it.
Yeah.
There's this great quote where you brought up in the book, which is that Jefferson's people went to like the industrial plan that Hamilton had pursued, and they were ready to throw it out because they thought, because philosophically, right, if they are these yeoman farmers, Jeffersonian Republicans, like obviously they're like, look, this is going to be corrupt, it's going to be terrible, but they, in very flowery 19th century language, obviously say there is not but one thing not great here. Let's keep it, right? So that was just a fascinating example.
I think it was. I think this was his Treasury Secretary, Gallatin, who was like, "It's the most perfect system ever conceived," or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And and Jefferson got really mad about it because of the politics of it. But yeah, and he ended up, and it wasn't just that; it was even in foreign policy, and basically in every way, he adopted all the Federalist best ideas.
Expands the military, sends the first overseas adventure, and when in many ways that was the opposite. That's perfect to consider.
So it's a synthesis still, right? Mm-hmm. So you get democratic republicanism under Federalist, or federalism under democratic Republican dressing, and neither side really won. They both won. We kind of did both. All right. So then the second party system, this is Jackson, right? So you get Jackson versus the Whigs, and this is a fight about what is it? I would say it's basically a great debate over the frontier, because what's changed now? So now the Federalist Democratic Republican debate is resolved. We've basically, America has answered what kind of republic it's going to be. And now we've expanded all the way across the Mississippi River, and we don't just have a bunch of little cities on the coast, and we have all these small farms, and people are like, okay, well, we have all this flowering language. How are we going to bring the people into government? We have these two different ideas. You have sort of the Whig idea of sort of sanctity of labor and we're going to build infrastructure and whatever, we're going to expand. But, they're really trying to build up where the Democrats are trying to build out, right? The Democrats really want to expand out where the Whigs want to build up into cities. And they both want to find a way to bring people into government. But, the Jacksonians are much more sort of rowdy about it, where the Whigs are much more sort of professional class about it. But regardless, we ended up doing both, right? We ended up taking some of the Whig ideas. We built all the infrastructure plans. Mm-hmm. All, the Whigs got basically all of their policy ideas of Henry Clay. He had this American system, which was sort of the heart of their system, which was that we were going to build, roads and canals and whatever to spread out west, which the Jacksonians thought was just boondoggles and wastes and money for bankers. But we ended up doing all of it. But we also did all of the democratizing ideas that the Jacksonians wanted to do. We spread out west. We created more land for settlers. We ended voting restrictions. So we ended up, again, doing both.
So
and then when we did both, the party died.
Well, quick thing, because I'm getting a slightly positive picture, but in the book, you specifically say the story of this second party system, however, is that this is how realignments can go wrong. So what goes wrong in the picture you're describing?
All right. So what goes wrong is once we resolve it, right? So by the 1840s, this debate is in practice dead, right? We have Andrew Jackson is still, he's gone and off the scene, and we have this. The Jacksonian ideas, he was fighting against the bank. We'd resolve the bank war stuff. There's really nothing to fight about in politics. So things start to stagnate. And then we have this new problem, which is what to do about as we expanded west, it was really about the Mexican-American War and the expansion west. And what are we going to do about slavery? Because all of a sudden in the Mexican-American War under Polk, we took land for, I forget how many states it was. It was something like 10 new states. And so now all of a sudden at the top of the agenda is, well, are they going to be slave or free? And the South obviously didn't want any more free states because they knew that if there were more free states, they were going to lose the Senate and that slavery would be abolished. So this issue that everybody wanted to push off was all of a sudden couldn't be pushed off because now we have 10 new states we have to admit, we have to decide today. And at the same time, there's the religious revival, the abolition movement and all this. We had a religious revival at the same time where all of a sudden, America throws itself back into religion, and their big issue is slavery is a moral evil. So when you had before this period where Americans were willing to sort of push off this debate because they didn't want to rip the country apart, now the new generation, and you could see them sort of like the 1960s, it's like, no, these are evils that have to be solved today. This cannot be delayed. And we're not willing to compromise. There's no compromise to be had. This is good and evil. So you see those two changes. So that's now the biggest issue that has to get resolved. And the political parties see it as a distraction. They see it as a big distraction from the real issues, which are the Jackson issues that nobody cares about anymore. Mm-hmm. And so they keep trying to push it off and compromise, and the compromise of 1850 and all those terrible compromises. And it rips it really rips both parties down. It rips the Whig party apart in 1852 because they're divided over the issue and they hate each other. Now Northern and Southern Whigs hate each other. And 2 years later, the Democrats get pushed out of Congress and the know-nothings take over, and we have a decade of political chaos. And the mistake that happened was the parties wanted to preserve the status quo of the dead issues when there was a new pressing crisis that they refused to acknowledge and tried to press off as a distraction.
With Band-Aids. And with very quickly distinguish. Actually, no, that's not even the right metaphor, because they were not just they're basically Band-Aids dipped in acid, because the actual Band-Aids made everything worse. So the compromise of 1850 actually made the crisis worse, because it basically said, wait, this is now arbitrary. you can't think the deals are going to be there. It's just, wow, that's useful too.
Well, and then right after it is, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where right after they do the compromise, Stephen Douglas stupidly, because he wants a railroad going through Chicago, reopens the question of the Missouri Compromise to try to get Kansas and Nebraska, which is already slated to be free states. He wants to make them, have this popular sovereignty, this idea that they'd have a vote, the settlers would have a vote. So now everyone's furious because now nobody trusts anybody. All these compromises don't even mean anything anymore because we're breaking them 2 years later. And then the real big problem is then all the settlers, because now it was a very stupid idea, popular sovereignty, because naturally political activists all moved to the state to stack the vote. So now you started having with guns, and then you got a basically bloody Kansas in a low-grade civil war, which then helped rip the Democrats apart too. So yeah, it was just a series of disasters, all built around treating what was the new debate that needed to be resolved as a distraction, and trying to double down on a party system that was, for all intents and purposes, dead, because it was about issues that didn't matter. And that's why the Whig Party and the Democrat, and the Democrats they survived it, but they got really hammered. The Whig Party collapsed, and we had really a decade of utter chaos. That was with the Know Nothing Party coming in, and three parties for a while, and all kinds of political violence. Because once the system fell apart, then it would only have to be put back together by blood and tears, and that's the worst. That was the worst realignment, and it's the one to avoid.
Yeah, so basically we can skip the Civil War because that one's self-evident how that ended, right, basically. But so that takes us into the third party system. What was the third party system? Who were the figures, and how did it resolve itself?
Yeah, well, the third party system is what came out of the Civil War. It was now a new Republican Party that represented the North, and a Democratic Party that represented the South. And it really, the great debate was Reconstruction. It was the aftermath of the war.
Actually, quick thing. It's not even that they represented the South. In many ways, they represented the quote unquote losers, right? So the people, and this is where it leads us into our earlier conversation about William Jennings Bryan. It's Midwesterners who've been left behind. The frontier has closed, so expansion is no longer just an option. If you fail in Kentucky, you just can't keep moving. Well, if it's the 1820s, if you fail in Kentucky, you just go west. But eventually it closes. That's the whole Frederick Jackson Turner thing.
Yeah, well, or the immigrant political machines is actually the other. That's the other really great part of the Democratic Party of that era, is all the Irish machines like Tammany Hall in New York, right? New York is controlled by the Republican Party. So if you're an Irish immigrant and you want political influence, you're going to be a Democrat. So all those political machines, the urban political machines that got set up in the North, that under the banner of the Democratic Party, it's because they were the ones locked out of the system. The system was controlled by the Republicans. So if they wanted to push back and get control of the system, they did it as Democrats. So and then you had this bizarre alliance, right, between Tammany Hall and the Irish immigrants and all, in all the cities you had the urban immigrant political machines, and then the South, and they hated each other, but they had a common interest, so they worked together.
You say it that way, and it's quite obvious why this political coalition did not win many presidential elections when you put it that way.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, but the worst part of that party system, and this is what we're talking about again, the Gilded Age, because it's really vibrant for a short period of time until we get to the end of Reconstruction. But once Reconstruction ends, and basically both of the parties realized, I mean, there was a number of reasons about why that happened. There was an economic downturn, there was the horrible Tilden election and everything. And but the biggest thing was America got tired. They'd been fighting this thing since the Civil War. It had been 15 years of bloodshed and then trying to occupy the South, and they just gave up. And that created the Gilded Age, where really after that point, nothing was happening. So you had two parties.
The ultimate example of nothing is happening in politics is like the big debate was civil service reform, which is just inconceivable by our point in terms of our time of what would be the big. I'm not saying it mattered, right? I'm not saying it wasn't an important issue. It actually resolved like an important depending on your politics. Well, it leads to, yeah.
It was a response to that corruption because politics died, right? Politics basically ends for a while at Reconstruction. But practical problem. Nothing's happened. There's still politics. There's still elections. There's still people holding offices. But there's really nothing on the table, because what's on the table, everybody knows isn't going to happen. So we run elections on Robinism and rebellion. And the only thing that's happening is corruption, and all the railroad companies are buying off politicians, and politicians are pure careerists. And the corruption got so bad, which is why civil service reform is the only thing people are talking about. And it cuts again across the parties. It's not even really partisan. It's the politics is so decayed that there's a faction of good government people who want to do something about all the corruption, and then everybody else who's just using the government like a gravy train.
Yeah. So that we covered the
Bryan.
Yeah, we covered Bryan. So let's take it.
Well, and what's the debate? And what's important about the debate is, right, economic transformation, industrialization, right?
Yeah.
Like, what do we do about the middle class getting left behind? And, all the immigrants now, again, immigration is another big deal because the cities are exploding with opportunities and factories. And what are we going to do about, the conditions in some of these factories where you get stuff like child labor and all the progressive issues to deal with all the abuses in early industrialization? And, you had an America that was built around agricultural issues, and the biggest issue now is adjusting to a new economy.
So then,
which is then,
the
New Deal.
So then, where does that leave us? Because the key thing is that, and this is the part which is taking it to the earlier part of your conversation. We did this in a semi-interesting order, which is basically that these, in the 50s, everything we're discussing is really summed up under the realignment theory. And I'm noticing as we're talking about the timeline between these different realignments, it's actually much shorter than the period from the New Deal to today. So why is that? Because there's obviously no iron law of history or science or Hegelian thought that says realignment shall last 30 years. But why has this period lasted so long? Let me put it a better way. Yeah, so why has this period lasted so long? And why haven't big events, which conceivably could have spurred changes not made, had the effect? So, for example, the Cold War ending, September 11th, the 2008 financial crisis. Many people saw that as a reset opportunity, didn't happen. What was going on at a meta level during this realignment period?
All right. Yeah. So so let's just start. So you start sort of foundationally. So what is liberalism and conservatism? All right. So politics, liberalism and conservatism come out of the New Deal, right? So before this, we have populism and progressivism. The Republican Party is the progressive party of Teddy Roosevelt, married to the Yankee Calvin Coolidge people, which is an ideology that's both liberal and conservative in a weird way compared to today. It doesn't really match up. And then you get Bryan's populist Democratic Party, which eventually adopts sort of the Wilsonian fake progressive. There's a whole debate there about whether Wilson's really a progressive, but Wilson kind of grafts onto it. All right, so that's this debate. And it has nothing to do, and it doesn't graft with liberalism and conservatism that we now have, right? Those ideologies happen under FDR. So FDR is faced with the Great Depression. The Republican Party under Hoover gets demolished, and the Republicans get thrown out of office. FDR becomes the president, and he has to solve the crisis. And he gets this brain trust. He gets all the smartest people he can find to do whatever they can do to solve the problem. And he doesn't pull from partisans. He pulls a lot of Republicans and a lot of Republican progressives. And they start innovating, and they create the New Deal is in two stages. The first New Deal is this progressive program. It's just like old progressivism is trying to use social science and expertise to plan the economy to fix the Depression. And then there's a backlash to it with Huey Long and Father Coughlin and all this. And then from populist Democrats, traditional populist Democrats, at which point you get the second New Deal, where then they add to it all the stuff like the Works Progress Administration and all the social spending to sort of directly put money in the hands of workers. So now you have two ideas, populism and progressivism, that had been split across the parties, are combined, and it becomes this new philosophy, liberalism, New Deal liberalism, or what we now call liberalism. So that's where that is. And then the response to that is conservatism. Why? So people fighting about the New Deal, they have two main objections. The first is this idea that it's an attack on liberty. It's big government. It's government that's taking on too much power. And you get stuff like the Liberty League. And a lot of these people, of course, are Democrats, right? They were with Roosevelt. They were Democrats. Guys like Al Smith and what's the guy who's former head of the DNC. You get a lot of big Democrats with this too. That it's an attack on liberty, or also it's un-American, that it's somehow undercutting the culture that led to American success and that the democracy needs to survive. Liberty and virtue, which then under Buckley gets combined formally into a new ideology, conservatism, right? It starts under FDR as sort of an ad hoc set of criticisms, and these critics who a lot of times don't even like each other, but they're now working together on the same team, and they get forged ultimately into one united ideological group. And Buckley and his team at the National Review turn it into a coherent ideology, conservatism, and that's where that comes from. So we invent these two ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. All right. What is that fight actually? It's a fight about how to manage an industrial economy, right? It's about, okay, we have a 20th century industrial economy. We have factories and cars and sort of the modern post-World War II world, well, originally the war and the post-war world. How do we manage that properly? And one set of solutions is New Deal liberalism, because New Deal liberalism came up as a solution to, okay, the Republic had been discredited by the Depression. A lot of people lost faith in America. They thought we needed to maybe reform it, maybe throw it out, do something like a modern government, by which they meant communism or fascism, which people at that time perceived as more successful and more modern. They thought democracy might be an outdated ideology that didn't fit modern industrial life. And so we have this crisis, and the solution FDR comes up with is liberalism. And then conservatism says, hey, okay, we can reform our institutions to deal with modernity, but let's take into account this liberty and virtue, and we can't go too far, and we need to put limits on it. And this is the debate that we're having. All right. So why does it last as long as it does? Because that debate is relevant as long as it is. As long as we have an industrial economy and we're fighting over what is the proper way to regulate it, it's a relevant debate. It also took that long to resolve because the Democrats basically ran the system until at least the 70s, when this conservative movement started pushing back, and then ultimately under Reagan got their turn to put in their reforms. So that story of how that played out, the Democrats put their ideas in through the original New Deal, and eventually expanding it into social issues with the Great Society. And then the Republicans, they start pushing back and they start saying, okay, well, where are the limits? Where do we reform it? And that starts in the 70s, and then under Reagan, and then sort of the conservative pushback through the 90s. And then in the 90s, what happens? Well, under the Gingrich-Clinton fight, both ideas come to their endpoint, because the Democrats realize, well, this is as far as the New Deal liberalism is going to go. We are not going to, there will be no new Great Society. It's done. We've gone as far. We don't want to lose what we've done, but we're not going to go any farther. This is the limits of our ideas. They basically are now out of ideas. They have nothing else to do. Healthcare is the one thing that they keep talking about that they still would like to do. And the conservatives have also reached the end of their ideas, because they've unwound from Reagan through the 90s parts of the New Deal that they didn't like. We're going to reform welfare as we know it. We're going to put cost-benefit analysis.
Because the key thing here is that the part which pushes this towards Democrats is that Republicans, as an electoral necessity, accept the broad constructs of the New Deal. So you're not running against the existence of Medicare and Medicaid. You're not running to overturn Social Security. That's their limit there.
Yeah, and then by the 90s, you saw that under the Gingrich Congress, where people is still trying to float, we're going to privatize Social Security, and it becomes obvious we're not undoing Medicare, we're not undoing Social Security. We've done the limits of our ideas, and the American people. Why did they reach the limits? The American people were basically happy with the consensus, right? They were like, okay, we like Social Security and Medicare and these programs. We're okay with these new agencies. We don't want to undo them, but we like the conservative limits that they put on them. We like all of these other things that need to be taken into account. We don't think that they should just be unlimited.
I'm just smiling real quick because because when you're talking about agencies, there's no actual constituency for abolishing the Department of Education. There's obviously like a conservative argument for why that's an overreach, but that's not actually something which is going to drive an actual policy outcome.
And every time that they talk about it, they end up having to backtrack on it because the American people are like, what? You don't like education? And then that's the end of it. Because, and then the biggest problem too, so you had all that in the 90s where the ideas, we've reached the end of the ideas. And now the economy changed. So it's not even relevant anymore. So the whole fight that we started under FDR, not only have we basically reached a national consensus, we also now have a post-industrial global modern world with all kinds of new problems that have nothing to do with an industrial economy and to which the party's toolkits don't have anything to respond to. Because if you try to come up with, okay, what do we do with the rise of AI or the rise of China? All right. Is the answer more New Deal programs? It doesn't make any sense. Is the answer fight big government? It doesn't make any sense. The two parties have toolkits that are built to dealing with industrial problems that don't have tools for the problems we now have. And that ultimately is led to stagnation because we have two coalitions built around ideologies meant to solve problems that no longer exist. And we have new problems that need solutions that they don't have tools. And if they try to create tools, it means breaking orthodoxy. It means alienating their coalition. It means doing something brand new. And they haven't chosen to do it. So they don't have any tools to solve the problem. And all these problems, as they start racking up, people want answers. What are we going to, people's lives are being affected. They want answers. What are you going to do about this stuff? And both parties basically have sort of orthodoxy that it's a non sequitur to the problems we have. So why did it take that long? It took that long both for the industrial era to end and for a new debate to start. It took us that long to resolve the debate in the first time. And there's no magic to how long it takes. It just took us longer because of the way the world changed, the rate at which the world changed. And then there's this other issue of what happened and then we were talking about the 60s, where so in the 50s, so everybody thought there was going to be a realignment in around the 60s to the 80s because it had been about the right amount of time based on the past. And clearly something big was going on. And then everybody was gearing up for it. And they thought that all this social disruption that was happening was the heart of what would be a realignment. And then the realignment didn't happen because the Democrats ideologically just added new issues. The Republicans added new issues. We took what had been economic liberalism and we extended it into social problems of social liberalism of the Great Society. We took economic conservatism. We're going to fight economic big government like taxes and regulation. Now we're going to fight social big government like the Great Society. Mm-hmm. So the ideologies didn't change, and then everybody got frustrated with why it didn't happen.
To make this clear for everyone, because an earlier example is really useful was the point about the Second Bank of the United States after Jackson. So Jackson ends it, the issue dies in the 1840s. But this is the situation we're in now is as if a new situation in 1842 brought back up the debate again. Is that the correct way of understanding what you're saying? So what I'm saying is that the reason why it's going on is that, so let me put it a better way. The reason, if I'm correct, the reason why the realignment doesn't happen is that the issues or the debates that you were describing reapply themselves in new contexts. Is that it?
Yeah, I guess that's sort of, or don't see the big thing to me about the mid 20th century social change is that the economic issues didn't go away, right? It's not like the taxes and regulation part of the New Deal fight went away or had become irrelevant. So the parties grafted new issues onto themselves that were still attractive to their existing coalitions. But the original issues were still there and relevant and live issues that we were still fighting about in politics. So to create a new party system, we would have had to have thrown away the New Deal debate, the fight from the 30s about taxes and regulations and regulatory agencies and big government. That would have had to have gone away, but it didn't. We just expanded it into new issues without getting rid of the old ones.
Can I just put on my super liberal hat real quick? Just something I'm just realizing. Sure. Is it possible that the reason why this realignment has just taken so long is just the issue of race? In the sense that how much of the backlash against the Great Society is really about like racial issues, and there's a world where for America where Sweden, for example, we would have just accepted, policy merits aside, the ideals. So for example, if there's no racialized welfare queen discourse, have we not effectively settled the debate over how involved in the economy the government is?
Yeah. I think probably that's
right.
It's hard to know because
it's interesting, right?
It's fascinating. Yeah. And well, I've thought about it a little too, because particularly when you start talking about what, Nixon was up to in the 70s when he did his law and order campaigns, like he was it was both a natural extension of Republican ideology into social issues, right? Where the Republican Party opposes big government. The Democrats are now doing big government in social things. So naturally, it's not really a change what Nixon did to oppose social big government, because ideologically, of course, the Republican Party wouldn't like social big government. It's still big government, which was the core of the party. Mm-hmm. And yet, Nixon was very aware while he was doing this of the racial implications of the rhetoric that he was employing. And you can read Pat Buchanan, who was part of that campaign, or Kevin Phillips or whatever. They were aware of that as well. So it's one of these things that points both ways, right? Where if that issue didn't exist, maybe it would have played out, maybe we could have wrapped up the fifth party system a little faster. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could have gotten into the next one. Because to me, the fascinating part is not even just why did it take so long, is that, I think we've been done with the New Deal debate since at least the 90s. So it's also taken us a long time. Why didn't we march? Why didn't Obama march into the next party system? He could have. People were he had a mandate to do whatever he wanted. His rhetoric seemed to acknowledge that people wanted some, not just normal change, but like that there were new problems that
something
needed new solutions. Right. And yet he governed as a New Deal Democrat. Well, why did he do that? Right. Like he did that, and then Trump comes in, and then, with Trump, you could say, well, he stares building a new coalition, but then he doesn't build anything new.
He governs. He governs he governs within the traditional Republican. Larry Kudlow is his economic policy person.
Yeah, I've always said he's basically James Buchanan, because if you look at like James Buchanan,
so not Andrew Jackson.
No, I think he's James Buchanan, because James Buchanan is a guy who. So this is in the years before he's the last president before the Civil War. He can see that the system is starting to fray. He sees the political opportunities. You could say the same of Franklin Pierce, his predecessor too. They see the political opportunities on these new issues, but they're not willing to throw out the old orthodoxy and actually do anything about them. So they use the political energy to help rip things down without building anything. And I've always thought Trump is a very similar type of figure, where he was savvy to see the old system, when he starts tapping into the populism and all these different sort of, just rhetorically, he taps into it to win votes, but he doesn't actually do anything transformational in what he actually governs with. So he doesn't build a new party with it, and he just uses this force to help tear things down a little faster without actually doing the rebuilding of the next party system,
What's fascinating about that is I brought up Andrew Jackson for a reason, because Steve Bannon, when he came into the White House, was very clear about wanting Trump to be a Jacksonian figure, in the sense that if the Trumpian Bannonite project was successful, it would be the Andrew Jackson metaphor would be perfect. There would be these it would be a realignment. There would be these big issues. There was, you could in many ways argue like the post-World War II international order, NAFTA, all these things that Trump ran against could have been the equivalent of the second bank of the United States. But I think the clear implication of what you're saying is that the failed version of Trump equals the successful version of Trump is Jackson. The failed version of Trump, the Trump that does not win re-election, is Buchanan.
Exactly. And that's ultimately, that's his personality. He's not a policy wonk. He's not really
but
interested
neither was
in that.
Jackson.
So,
But this is the thing which is interesting, right? So
yeah.
So I guess there's a deeper. What my point there is that the cleavage to me.
But Jackson had Van Buren. That was the difference, right? Jackson had Van Buren, who was to help him. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
No.
But I agree.
Yeah.
Well, FDR wasn't either. And that's, one of the things I find fascinating about FDR is he also wasn't a policy guy. He just knew it was important and put policy people in charge.
Yeah, that was it's really, and this takes us to the current moment. Two last questions here. So one, what do you think of Joe Biden in all of this context? Because the thing that interests me about Joe Biden, and this could be drinking too much like DC area Kool-Aid or just exhaustion with the Trump era, but I just genuinely think there is something, at least so far, to the Joe Biden as LBJ or the Joe Biden as FDR in several senses. So sense number one, like not geniuses. No one thought that FDR was like, a lot of his contemporaries would like remark about the fact that he wasn't the brightest bulb.
Right.
LBJ was not well read, was not particularly, he was very bright but in a different, in a very much, he was not coming from Harvard. He's not, JFK quoting poetry and doing all the great stuff. Street smart, exactly. But from a political perspective, FDR and LBJ are much more politically successful than their obviously successful predecessors, obviously more intellectual predecessors, Wilson, for example, and JFK,
or Hoover.
Or Hoover, exactly. Yeah, Hoover's got
Hoover's brilliant.
Brilliance plus hyper competence. Most impressive. Man, lots of second placers during this conversation.
Yeah.
But so, what do you just think? I know, and then when we put this way, then too, which is that it just seems to me, I mean, the approval ratings you're getting out of Biden right now are incredible. And obviously the Obama defender part of my personality could say, well, look, like Biden is governing without the race issue. Like there's no like Obama phones controversy. There's no there's no, birth certificate controversy. Yeah. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I still think there's something to the idea that despite Joe Biden's lack of like intellectual impressing everyone at the like salon or something, he has a political talent that these really transformational presidents had. So I'm just curious what you think about all that.
Yeah. I think it's up for grabs. So, and this is what I've been thinking. I thought this watching the whole Democratic primaries. And so the chance to be FDR or Teddy Roosevelt or William Jennings Bryan is clearly up for grabs. And it's not up for grabs for most presidencies. Most times
Carter doesn't have it.
Yeah, the stars have to be aligned where the old system has decayed enough and there's new issues and an opportunity to be that transformational figure. You can't be a transformational figure when the existing political system is working fine and solving people's problems adequately, because you're not going to build a 50% new coalition around new ideas when you can't get 50% of the people who are unhappy with the old system. So, but now Joe Biden has the opportunity to, and that's why I was actually looking a lot. I kept watching Pete because thinking he could be a Bryan, right? Because he's this young, come in, throw out he kept talking about how he wanted to throw out all the old orthodoxy. And then you look at Biden and he ran like FDR in that he ran on sort of restoring stability in the old order. But then like FDR had the choice to throw it out. Because, the fascinating thing about FDR to me is he didn't run on the New Deal. Mm-hmm. He ran on old Democratic Party ideas of the former system. He attacked Hoover for his deficits. His big campaign issue was Hoover was spending too much, which, that was a traditional Democratic attack. And then turned around and when given the wheel, threw out everything, threw out the orthodoxy and did something new. And I think Biden could do that. The question is, will he? And that's why I've looked at him saying, yeah, he could. He absolutely could. The question is does he have the will and the desire to do it? But to do it, he would have to throw out the old issues and look ahead to not just restoring stability of the system that's dead, right? if all we're going to do is put this decision off a couple years to shore up a system that no longer solves people's problems, then we're going to be back here in 2-4 years anyway, right? If the result of a Biden presidency is that we just keep the fifth party system debate going on even farther, then the same opportunity will exist in the next election and somebody else is going to seize on it. But if he chose to, yeah, he could do it. And it's been fascinating to me because I think he might. I've been thinking he might, but
yeah,
he's in a tough spot because you have to alienate, just like FDR did. You have to alienate a lot of your key supporters and your staff and people who have built their career in the party, because it means anything you do that's innovative is going to bring in new people and alienate old people. And that takes great courage to do. But yeah, he could. I think he has the opportunity. He might have the personality and the desire, and the opportunity, I think, yeah, it definitely exists. That it's just a question of will he do it.
I think I'll make a particularly not brave prediction, and I see Biden as being a necessary figure in the sense that, because like you said, there are really terrible realignments, there are transitional realignments, and there are good realignments. I think Biden, once again, for all of our right-wing listeners, this is me just hypothesizing in good faith. We have a very active comments section, as you could tell. So I know some people are getting hyperventilating right now, but the best case scenario for me for Biden is that Biden is the necessary transitional figure. We need to have a good realignment. So Biden is the figure that can calm American politics down from the breaking point that Trump was pushing it towards. I think that it's something that's always difficult for me is when people complain about wokeness and excesses of the left. Like it seems to me as like, guys, this is obviously a result of Trump upping the ante. Because he's a figure who polarizes. And in that sense, if he's going to push the right to be right, the left will be left, and that will be that. I think Biden has the opportunity to stabilize, hopefully during an economic post-COVID boom, to stabilize and then give both parties the opportunity to get their stuff together, which in many ways is his argument for the Mayor Pete wing of the party, which is where he's very explicitly saying, I'm the bridge to the next generation. Like I'm okay. Yeah, please.
I'm gonna give you the dark side of that though.
Please.
Which is Trump stumbled into being Trump, but he's tested the product now. There will be somebody in the next election who is savvier and more ruthless, who sees these opportunities and seizes upon them. And I don't know that we have the time to stabilize things. I truly don't. I'm concerned that the difference, we talk about good and bad realignments, and it really comes down to, does the leader of the party choose to throw out the orthodoxy and start fresh? Look at the problems fresh and say, let's do something that deals with the new problems ahead, and let's forget everything we thought we knew about what we believed in, what we cared about, because we have new problems and we need a new ideology not just ideology, we need a new approach. Okay. So if the leader does that, then we don't need to have the collapse, because we get the realignment no realignment's easy. It's still a hard, people get angry, you get rough years of politics, but you get without the collapse. But if you wait too long and nobody does it, it'll happen on its own. And that's what the Whig collapse is about, where it'll happen because if the leaders don't do it, then external forces will force it. And then that's the hard way, because that'll take years. It's much harder to rebuild something when there's a vacuum, when every crazy person with a bad idea starts jumping into the public stage and says, here, I want attention, I want power. And then you have to resolve it from the rubble. And that's what I'm worried about, is that if a leader doesn't come around and do it, then that's how it plays out. And the question is, how long do we have until events, I feel like the candle wick is getting a little low on how many more presidencies we can have before somebody either chooses to do it before it happens on its own. That's my concern.
That's
a little, that's the bummer side. That
I think that's the perfect place to end. Frank, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. I look forward to doing this again soon. And hey, where can everyone find you? I'd love for you to promote the YouTube. I watch the YouTube channel to prep and everything, so I'd love for you to promote it real quick.
Yeah. So I've got a YouTube series where I go a lot of political history and going through the sort of the story of realignments and how they work. It's Frank DiStefano at YouTube. On YouTube, just Frank DiStefano is the name of the channel. And the book is the Next Realignment, and all of it is laid out there too.
Great, thanks so much.